Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. This is the first lecture of 2022. And in the wake of the premiere of The Gilded Age, which was on HBO on Monday night, written by Lord Julian Fellowes, we are going to be immersing our friends and our members in a lot of aspects of The Gilded Age, and we're going to be doing it throughout the year. So hang on. I hope it's going to be a lot of fun. We hope to shed a lot of light on a long overdue and somewhat misunderstood topic of American history. And we're very, very excited about this year. Our next program is on Thursday, February 10th at 6 o'clock. It's going to be Zoom as well. It will feature Michael Kramer, who is an internationally acclaimed gilder, who is going to be discussing the history of gilding as an artistic practice. And registration for that is going to be available on our website very soon. You might have some questions tonight. Please feel free to ask them. Go to the Q&A portion of your screen, write them in, and Leslie Jones, our curator and director of museum affairs, who's going to speak in a moment, will do her best to make sure that all the questions get tended to. We have an unbelievable panel of exceptional historians, knowledgeable, lots of expertise. So I am very honored to introduce them to you. Dr. Kerry Driscoll is the professor of English at the University of St. Joseph and is currently associate editor at the Mark Twain Papers and Project at the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Carroll Van West is the director and history professor at the Center for Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State University, and he is also the Tennessee State Historian. Pieter Roos is the executive director of the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, and we are delighted to be co-sponsoring tonight's lecture with the Mark Twain House and Museum. And Peter is known to many in Newport because he is the former director of the Restoration Foundation. And then Dr. James Golden is the director of interpretation at Historic Deerfield. So you can see we've got a great panel. Before we welcome each member of this panel, I want to hand things over to Leslie, our director of museum affairs and chief curator, who is going to provide a contextual starting point for tonight's discussion. Thank you all very much for being with us.
Thank you, Trudy, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think one of the most important questions many of us are coming to tonight's discussion with is, what is the Gilded Age? As Trudy mentioned, we're going to address just that. That's why we've gathered this wonderful group of scholars together to sort of assess the term from its social, political, and economic stances in American history, as Twain and Dudley put together in their 1873 publication, The Gilded Age, which coined the term for the first time. It is important to note, though, that even though the book itself, published during what we consider the Gilded Age, didn't necessarily create a contemporary buzz for the word to be used to describe the lifetime people were living at the end of the 19th century. It wasn't until the 20th century when scholars and historians began using the term widely. And there are also other terms used to describe this period, such as the Progressive Era, the Feast of Material Plenty, Age of Reform, and even it overlaps with the very familiar time period known as the Era of Reconstruction. So with that small context set, I'm going to hand it off to Kerry Driscoll, who will give us a wonderful overview of the book itself and where it fits into the American historical story. Kerry?
Can I interrupt for just a minute, please? We've had several people write and say, please, everyone, speak up as loudly as you can so that you can be heard. So Kerry, don't be shy.
Okay. Before beginning, I'd like to set the stage by sharing two descriptions Mark Twain gave of Newport that offer a sense of how he felt about the place. The palace was far, far away toward the rising sun, immeasurably remote, astronomically remote, in Newport, Rhode Island, holy land of high society, ineffable domain of the American aristocracy. And 3 years later, in his autobiography, he referred to the city as that breeding place that stud farm, so to speak, of aristocracy of the American type, that auction mart where the English nobilities come to trade hereditary titles for American girls and cash. The man did not mince words, eh? Now on to the topic of tonight's presentation. The Gilded Age, published in December 1873, is the first time Mark Twain undertook the writing of a novel. His two previous books, The Innocents Abroad and Roughing It, had been humorous travelogues, recounting journeys to Europe, the Holy Land, and the American West. As such, The Gilded Age represents an important step in his development as a writer, particularly since he is best known today as a novelist. The book is also significant as the only time that Mark Twain ever collaborated with another author in a literary career that spanned nearly 50 years. And here you can see Clemens on the left and Charles Dudley Warner on the right. The novel was supposedly inspired by a conversation at a Hartford dinner party in early 1873, when Clemens and his neighbor, Hartford Current editor Charles Dudley Warner, teased their wives about the lackluster quality of the contemporary novelists they were reading. In response, the women issued a challenge. Okay, why don't you two see if you can do any better? The men agreed and immediately set to work. In some respects, it was an unusual collaboration. Rather than sitting together and writing, Clemens and Warner engaged in a parallel process, each taking responsibility for large chunks of the narrative. As Clemens recalled, Warner would work until he was tired, and I would work till I was tired, in the superstition that we were writing one coherent yarn, when I suppose, as a matter of fact, we were writing two incoherent ones. Clemens began the book writing 399 pages, in other words, the novel's first 11 chapters, then invited Warner over, read it aloud, and handed him the manuscript. At that point, Warner took up the story, introduced new characters and plot lines, and wrote chapters 12 to 23. And back and forth it went. This image on your screen showing page 399, the very end of chapter 11, illustrates these distinct stages of composition, right? Now comes Warner's first chapter. The Gilded Age was also written quickly, begun in January and completed in rough draft by April 1873. Next slide, please, Leslie. Here's a letter Mark Twain wrote to his wife, Olivia, on April 26th. Darling, I have finished trimming and revamping all my manuscript, and today we began the work of critically reading the book, line by line, and numbering the chapters and working them together in their appropriate places. It is perfectly fascinating work. All of the first 11 chapters are mine, and when I came to read them right along without breaking, I got really interested. On page 2 of the letter, however, he rather smugly confides, Warner failed in his description of one of the characters. I finally took a paper and pencil, had a thought as to phraseology, and scratched it down. Then we read our two efforts, and mine being rather the best, we used it. And in 1874, in response to a friend's complaint that she didn't care for the novel, Mark Twain fired off this reply. I think you don't like The Gilded Age because you've been reading Warner's chapters. He then listed the sections he wrote and commanded, now you read those. The Gilded Age is a big book, about 600 pages long, part melodrama, part scathing political satire of American greed, materialism, and social pretension, as well as an indictment of federal corruption. Its overly elaborate plot defies easy summary, so I'd instead like to just mention two of the novel's most memorable and enduring characters, the first of whom you can see here. The first is Kernel Sellers, based on Clemens's mother's favorite cousin, James Lambton, an incurable dreamer and speculator, full of get-rich-quick schemes that never amount to anything, such as his infallible imperial oriental optic liniment and salvation for sore eyes. He insists that these ideas, each more outlandish than the next, have whole Atlantic oceans of cash in them, with gulfs and bays thrown in, if only he can find the right investors, which of course he never does. Meanwhile, the Sellers family lives in absolute poverty, subsisting on a diet of uncooked turnips and cold water. But despite his habitual failures, Sellers never gives up, and even more remarkably, remains steadfast in his effervescent optimism. Eventually, Sellers travels to Washington, D.C., seeking a congressional appropriation to build a school for freed slaves on land belonging to a family friend from Tennessee. The novel contains a memorable chapter on the cost of doing business in the nation's capital, with illustrations of the amounts needed to bribe key players. Next slide, please. And you can see here, the chairman of the committee's price tag is $10,000. The male lobbyist is $3,000. The female lobbyist is the same amount, and the high moral senator is $3,000 as well. Glittering receptions are held at the mansions of the district's political elite, where drawing rooms were brilliant with gaslight and as hot as ovens. Upon entry, guests passed into the maelstrom of bejeweled and richly attired low-necked ladies and white kid-gloved and steel pen-coated gentlemen. This is a world in which the appearance of great wealth matters almost as much as its substance. The novel's embodiment of political corruption, next slide please, is the portly, bald Senator Dilsworthy, modeled on disgraced Kansas Senator Samuel Pomeroy, seen here in a photograph on the left. And you can see an illustration from the novel paired with it on the right. A likeness that would have been instantly recognizable to readers in 1873. Beneath his pious, smarmy, upstanding political image, Dilsworthy is thoroughly unscrupulous, buying votes to ensure his reelection and routinely accepting bribes. Lastly, Newport itself receives brief mention in the novel, in a chapter describing the capital's three distinct aristocracies: the so-called antiques, old money, the middle ground, and the social climbing parvenus, the nouveau riche. On a rare occasion, when an antique deigns to visit the drawing room of a parvenu, she condescendingly remarks, "Are you fond of watering places, Miss Hawkins? We of Washington are unfortunately situated in respect to fashionable ones. It is a tedious distance to Newport, but there is no help for it. Newport is damp and cold and windy and excessively disagreeable, but it is very select. One cannot be fastidious about minor matters when one has no choice." The subtitle Twain and Warner chose for their 1873 novel identifies it as a portrait of American society in the post-Civil War era. However, the world of chicanery and human foible described in its pages still resonates. Nearly 150 years after its original publication, The Gilded Age remains, for better or worse, a tale of today. Thank you.
Now let's shift directions to Tennessee, which serves as a basis for the entire novel, The Gilded Age. And if you go to where Twain sets his story in this rural town that he named after the Obed River that passes nearby, it is an actual place that you can visit today. It is called Jamestown, Tennessee, It's the county seat of Fentress County. And the first slide that you see in front of you are depictions of that park. It's named for Mark Twain. Jamestown has no shame. Twain was conceived in Fentress County, was not born there. He was born in Missouri. But they want to make that connection to Twain. And they have a wood sculpture of him. And then they have restored the spring that the Twain family took their water from. But of course, as is true in so many good stories, maybe the whole story hasn't been told. And if you really want to think about the setting of the novel, so much of it is in Twain's own family, beginning with his father, John Marshall Clemens. Now, John Marshall Clemens was actually a big fish in the small pond of Jamestown and Fentress County. He was a county official. He was a prominent land speculator. And in fact, as Twain related later in life, for many, many years, the family always thought that that would pay off one day and that land would become part of their fortune. But if you go to Fentress County today, it's got under 20,000 population for the entire county. It is rural, it is small, it is still poor. It's one of the poorer counties in the state. The nature of the topography did not make for riches to come from the ground, at least not at that time, not when John Clemens acquired his property, and not at the time that Mark Twain wrote his novel. Next slide. Here's, I've showed you close-ups from the park. Here's the park today, a green spot right off of the town square in Jamestown. And, you know, when you look at this context to the story and to Clemens' own life, you know, there's some realities that keep on repeating itself actually in the novel. And some stories maybe not told as well or as fully as they should be. The Clemens family were enslavers. They owned one enslaved person, a female woman between the age of 20 and 30. So when they tell the story in Jamestown of the Clemens family going to the spring to draw their water, most likely it was that Black woman who did that work. But now, of course, just one slave within the context of Tennessee meant that his parents were not major slave owners. In fact, they would have been classified as a sort of middle-class family at that time. The large planters, the slave owners who owned the larger plantations in the state, we feel that it takes the ownership of about 20 enslaved people for that. So in general, this whole story comes out of a setting that was poor then and is still poor now. One thing that's always been interesting to those of us who love to read Mark Twain is that Jamestown and Fentress County love to make so much to do about, well, his family was here and he was conceived here. Once they left Tennessee, he was born in Missouri about 4 to 5 months later. Okay, great. But they never say anything about the Gilded Age novel. And I don't know if that's because it's not one of Twain's best known pieces by far. And they've never really looked at the story of that novel and how the early chapters are set in their own county. So maybe one day they'll have a viewing and a symposium on the Gilded Age HBO show, but I would say right now they're not seeing that connection. But there is a big Tennessee connection to this phrase, the Gilded Age. When I look at what that period means in Tennessee history, and I would say by extension, most of the South and a good part of the nation, there's 3 terms that come right to mind. The first of those is reform. Next slide. One thing that does develop during this time period, it started in Nashville in 1872, was the creation of Central University, a new college created by the Methodist Church South, which was a segregated white denomination, to make sure that they could train ministers and train the beat up, damaged Southerners from the Civil War into what they needed to know to compete in this new age that was coming. Now, a year after Central University is created, a major donor known as Commodore Vanderbilt donates a huge sum of money to the school. And they changed the name from Central University to Vanderbilt University. And here you see the really first major building of Vanderbilt University, Kirkland Hall, that still stands on the campus today. But again, the reform initiative there was for white Southerners who, the South was devastated by the Civil War. And so many different reform groups, it wasn't just the Vanderbilts, it was also the Peabody family, invested in the state's education during this time to create a new foundation. But it was only for white people. Next slide. Blacks in Nashville took care of their own business. They created across the street from Vanderbilt University, Roger Williams University. And you can see the two buildings are both Victorian, they're both quite ornate, but Roger Williams gets erased from the story because that's the story line of repression. There was reform for whites and repression for blacks during this period of the 1870s and 1880s. And that's a real reality that you always have to keep in mind with the phrase, the Gilded Age. That is going on. For example, in Tennessee, Roger Williams College develops, it's a Baptist-supported institution in the early 1870s. You can see it was ambitious and a beautiful group of campus buildings. Tennessee passes its first Jim Crow law in 1875. And in part, a reaction to those laws coming out of the southern states, the US Congress passes the first civil rights law in the United States in 1875. But it had been weakened in the compromise to get it approved by Congress. And then in 1883, the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. And then the full-fledged flight into Jim Crow America was underway with the approval of the Supreme Court that we don't need laws like that. You have a series of laws passed, not only in the South, but a good part of the nation, in fact, too much of the nation, over the next 13 years, that then gets ratified once again by the US Supreme Court in their infamous decision of Plessy versus Ferguson that said, well, separation is okay, segregation is fine as long as it's equal. So that theme of repression is also part of the legacy of this period. And then there's the legacy of exploitation. And of course, that returns us to the themes of the novel, because that was one thing Kernel Sellers believed in. Oh, he was going to build that school for freedmen. Now he didn't, the blacks built their school themselves. But then he also believed that that land and that opportunity would someday bring great riches. Now, ironically, that really hadn't materialized in Fentress County, Tennessee, and a good part of Tennessee by 1873. But there was another writer, a man named Joseph Killebrew, that only diehard Tennessee historians would know about. But he wrote a book in 1873 that was titled Resources of Tennessee. And it was basically a guidebook that said, boys, come and get it. We've got coal, we have timber, we might have other mineral wealth, come and get it. So finally, by 1881, there in Fentress County, where the Clemens family had lived in the 1820s to 1835, the colonists came And it was a group of German immigrants that were convinced to move to Fentress County by two individuals who actually lived in Minnesota that convinced them to come and create the town of Allert, which is north of where Jamestown is, and roughly in the area that the Clemens family owned that land. So we do see these contexts of reform, the creation of Vanderbilt, the creation of Roger Williams, and then we see the repression of the age, the passage of Jim Crow laws, and then Jim Crow becoming basically the law of the land. And we see the themes of exploitation, that certainly they did see so much of the nation as, hey, this is the place we need to go get what's there. And what happens in Tennessee with colonists and immigrants from other nations, the construction of railroads, coal mining, well, that's repeated in other parts of the nation. In the South, it's again, coal mining is so important. In the West, it's hard rock mining. And all of this is happening in this period that we call the Gilded Age. And again, I do have to sort of make my case for Tennessee. There is a Tennessee connection to so much of that national story. Thank you.
Now we're going to go to Hartford, Connecticut. And we want to look at the interaction between Twain and Warner a little bit more and how it interacted with the physical place. So next slide, please. And just to give you a little bit of context here, we're going to go back to the beginning with Twain. This is post-conception. He did indeed come from Missouri, and we all know that Mark Twain came from the Midwest, and if we know anything about him, we tend to think of him as a native of the Mississippi River, perhaps a homespun person, even a little rough cut part of that early America, the New Republic, but not as a sophisticated and worldly traveler. In his early days, I think that image of the rough cut Westerner would be somewhat correct. Growing up in Hannibal, Twain had a childhood that he remembered warmly. One of my favorite early Twain quotes is that he wrote, "Now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates." And that somehow bespeaks of a friendly childhood, that you can have daydreams like that. One dream that he shared with all of his friends was the desire to work on the river on a steamboat. And that was ultimately something that came to pass for him. Although before that happened, he spent time as a printer's apprentice. And as you can see on the photograph of the left, where we see Twain as or Samuel Clemens, as he then was, as a young teenager. And you can look at his belt line and you can see that he's taken printer's type and spelled out Sam. Printers were also the local newspaper publishers by and large, and Clemens tried his hand at writing jokes in newspapers and getting his first experience as a published writer, I suppose, in that way. As a young man, in his early 20s, as a 20-year-old, 19-year-old, he took on the daunting prospect of becoming a riverboat pilot. And this is not a lightly undertaken thing. Becoming a riverboat pilot meant memorizing roughly 1,100 miles of the Mississippi River, seeing all of its shifting currents and sandbanks and the snags that might develop, and knowing where you could pilot and where you couldn't. But by age 21, he'd learned all of that and had become an accomplished riverboat pilot. And he said later in life that if he had died as a riverboat pilot, he would have had a happy life. However, the Civil War came, and with that, the Mississippi River trade and the riverboat pilots trade disappeared really forever in many ways. And so, as he put it, he lit out for the territories with his older brother, Orion. If I could have the next slide, please. And here we really see Twain as a rough cut Westerner. He goes out to the Nevada territory with his brother, and his brother has been named by Abraham Lincoln as the territorial secretary. But Clemens finds that there's no pay in that, and so he becomes a reporter eventually for the Nevada Territorial Enterprise and really starts his writing career in earnest. He wanders around the West, mostly between California and Nevada, and writes for several papers, notably in San Francisco. And he also takes breaks occasionally to engage in unsuccessful attempts at prospecting. Next slide, please. And it's while in California that he hears a tale that he adapted and rewrote into his first well-known short story, which we still remember today, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which you'll see he put together one of his first books, which is a series of stories and essays, and the jumping frogs on the cover. But this short story came to the notice of Artemus Ward, who was really one of the Eastern Seaboard's best known, the country's best known humorists. And the short story gets published in the Saturday Evening Post. And that really starts to establish Twain's reputation as a writer. In 1867, he convinced his newspaper, the Alta California, to let him take what he referred to as the Great Pleasure Excursion aboard the steamer Quaker City. And he goes on a trip around the Mediterranean. And this is considered by many historians to be the first true pleasure cruise. And it lasts for months. And they go to European countries, although a lot of the passengers on the ship were really pilgrims who were looking to see the Holy Land. And he is truly acting as a correspondent. He's sending letters to the Alta California, and those letters are published in the paper and give Californians reading it a sense of what it's like to be in a foreign country that they'd never visited before. And ultimately, he takes all those writings and more, and he writes The Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress. And it becomes an enormous bestseller, not only for its abundant humor, but as a travel book as well. And we think of Twain as a fiction writer, I think, a lot today. But a lot of his contemporaries in the 19th century thought of him as a travel writer. And this is truly his first travel book, and it's still a good read today. A little factoid that's fascinating to me is that Innocents Abroad sold more copies during Twain's lifetime than anything else that he wrote. It was his lifetime bestseller. If I could have next slide, please. While on board the Quaker City, one of his companions was a young man named Charlie Langdon, whose miniature of his sister absolutely captivated Twain. The Langdons were as different from Twain as could possibly be. They were sophisticated, wealthy Easterners with a strong progressive bent, and really just could not have been more different than Sam Clemens. But he was nevertheless very impressed with Livy, and she ultimately was very impressed with him. And crucially, ultimately, he impressed her father as well. Their first date, another interesting little fact, was to go and hear Charles Dickens speak in New York City. Not a bad thing to do with your future wife. Ultimately, they were married in 1870, and they moved briefly to Buffalo. But in short order, they removed to Hartford, which is where our story really gets going. And if we can go to the next slide. At the time, Hartford was really one of the most urbane, wealthy, and sophisticated of American cities. And Twain first visits it in 1868, and he's absolutely falls in love with it. He stays, I believe, at the house of the Hookers, and he writes the following piece for the San Francisco newspaper, the same one, the Alta California. And he says, "They call New England the land of steady habits, and I see the evidence about me that it was not named amiss. As I came along the principal street today, smoking, of course, I noticed that of the 200 men in sight at one time, Only 2 were smoking beside myself. I had to walk 3 blocks to find a cigar store. I saw no one smoking beside myself. I had to walk 3 blocks to find a cigar store. I saw no drinking saloons at all in the street, but I was not looking for any. I hear no swearing here. I see no chewing tobacco. I have found nobody drunk. What a singular country it is. At the hospitable mansion where I am guest, I have to smoke surreptitiously when all are in bed to save my reputation, and then draw suspicion upon the cat when the family detect the unfamiliar odor. So far, I am safe, but I am sorry to say that the cat has lost caste. She has steadily decreased in popularity since I made my advent here. She has achieved a reputation for smoking and may justly be regarded as a degraded, a dishonored, a ruined cat. When Sam and Livy come to Hartford, they are among friends. Livy's family are well known to a number of the residents of a suburban glade on the western outskirts of the city, known as Nook Farm. This neighborhood and its influence on Twain is pivotal to our story, and here I am going to turn over the mic to my colleague, James Golden.
Hello, thank you, and I'll now introduce the co-author. Probably being Mark Twain's co-author is one of the great loss of limelight of literature. It's hard to stand up next to him. But Charles Dudley Warner is actually a fascinating figure in his own right. He was born in 1829, so he was 6 years older than Mark Twain. I know in these pictures he looks pretty much ancient. We couldn't find a young picture of him, so we'll imagine this is how he always looked. But he was born in 1829 in Western Massachusetts, so in a hardscrabble hill towns of Western Mass, kind of hardy swamp Yankee types. But he also had important experiences out west as well. He was involved in Missouri in railroads, chicanery, spent some time in Chicago. So and then made it back east as well. So it's important to note that a lot of the novel's plot points that turn on corruption and Western expansion and the development of the Midwest is also material that Warner would have been aware of as well. And that connection may have been an important part of the early friendship between Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, and Charles Dudley Warner. He ended up, as a newspaper editor in Hartford, and had some important early success in his own writing, including My Summer in a Garden, and then the wonderful Backlog Studies, both from the early 1870s. Backlog Studies is basically a compendium of the fireside chat of this neighborhood known as Nook Farm. It makes for wonderful reading to dip into and get an insight into the flavor of the neighborhood. Warner is also the person who wrote Everybody Complains About the Weather and Nobody Does Anything About It, which is often attributed to Mark Twain, which is again the great loss of limelight and stealing of focus. Even your best lines get attributed to Twain. But to the next slide, please. So here we have Nook Farm, a later map, an insurance map, and you can see the very top, Olivia L. Clemens is listed as the owner of the Clemens family property, and sort of complicated process involving shielding family assets from Twain's creditors later in life, publishing company basically going not the right way. But you can see how close together the neighborhood is, and you can see the importance of the Park River there, which runs into the Connecticut River in what's just south of downtown Hartford. Nook Farm had been started essentially as a compound or a neighborhood by two brothers-in-law, John Hooker and Francis Gillette, both abolitionists, and they essentially sold land to their associates, friends, family. John Hooker's wonderful account reads of the neighborhood. The early comers were generally family or personal friends, and we lived like a little society by ourselves, each of us making free of the other's houses, and each keeping open house, and all of us frequently gathering for a social evening or to welcome some friendly visitor distinguished in political, literary, or philanthropic life. So I think you get a great feel for the keeping of open house and this kind of the importance of conversation to the neighborhood. Next slide, please. There's the Park River itself, the Little River, the Park River, the beautiful grand houses looming above it. You can really get a sense of the bucolic nature of this Nook Farm neighborhood in an appropriate New England winter. Next slide, please. And this is the house of Isabella Beecher Hooker and John Hooker that would have been the mansion in which Sam Clemens degraded a poor innocent cat's reputation, still standing today. And it gives you a sense of the scale of architecture. This is a far cry from Fentress County, Tennessee. It's a far cry from Hannibal, Missouri. And it really speaks to the substance of the neighborhood. Next slide, please. Even the more quiet and gentle houses still are, they're not Newport cottages, but that you get a sense of grandeur in Nook Farm, the leafiness and the beauty. This would have been the daughter, as you can see from Elizabeth Hooker Gillette, that's the daughter and daughter-in-law of the founders of the neighborhood. And you just see how it all ties together. Next slide, please. And a classic outdoor scene of people gathering for this keeping of open house. Wonderful Victorian, I mean, I think they're probably boiling under those clothes, but they're still gathering together for that famed Nook Farm sociability. Next slide, please. So this is the only known interior of the house of Charles Dudley and Susan Lee Warner. Because Warner was a very prominent writer in the 19th century, his reputation hasn't really held up in the same way. He was profiled along with the other great Nook Farm figures, Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe, in Harper's in the 1880s. And there's a great description of this interior. For the decorative arts fans, it's interesting to note the attention to detail paid by the magazine to this literary house. And it comments, it is rich in bric-a-brac, much of it Oriental, collected by the owner during his several tours in Europe, the East, and Africa. The mantelpiece is unique. It is made of Saracenic tiles framed in California redwood. Most of the tiles are wall tiles from ancient houses in Damascus and Cairo, one from the Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem, and some small ones from the pavement of the courts in the Alhambra. So it speaks to Charles Dudley Warner's interest as a travel writer. You can see the prominence of the books. You get a real sense of the importance of travel, both to Warner and to Twain, and the elegance of the household. This is a place where people are coming and going frequently. They're entering houses without knocking. And William Dean Howells, another very important 19th century literary figure, newspaper editor, magazine editor, excuse me, commented on visiting both Twain and Warner. It seems to me quite an ideal life. They live very near each other in a sort of suburban grove. Their neighbors are the Stowes and Hookers and a great many delightful people. They go in and out of each other's houses without ringing, and nobody gets more than the first syllable of his first name. They call their minister Joe. Great outrage Victorian propriety at the fact that he was not the Reverend Dr. Twitchell, but just plain old-fashioned Joe. But I think there's something wonderful about this informal, convivial literary atmosphere based around travel. Next slide, please. And the last thing I want to note about Nook Farm is the importance of the female residents of Nook Farm. Harriet Beecher Stowe, single best-selling American novelist of the 19th century in terms of single novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was an important resident. Isabella Beecher Hooker, a very important women's rights activist of the 19th century, and the two women that, as Kerry Driscoll mentioned, whose teasing back inspired the Gilded Age itself, Susan Warner and Olivia Clemens. They're an important part of the story, and one of Twain's own letters to a good friend met on board the Quaker City that Peter alluded to tells you about their role in not just inspiring the novel, but helping it along. So Twain himself writes to his friend, every night for many weeks, Livy and Susie Warner have collected in my study to hear Warner and me read our day's work, and they have done a power of criticizing. I think that's really important. They have done a power of criticizing, so they're giving editorial feedback along the way. They both pleaded so long and vigorously for Warner's heroine that yesterday Warner agreed to spare her life and let her marry. He meant to kill her. I killed my heroine dead as a mackerel yesterday, but Livy don't know it yet. Warner may or may not kill her today. This is the boss chapter. We shall see. So I think there's something kind of amazing about this idea that it's a performative composition. They're writing it to be read aloud to their wives. Their wives are doing a power of criticizing. And it's also important to note that Susan Warner is at a piano. She was a noted musician and lecturer on music. And a visitor, another woman, Harriet Lewis Paff, who stayed with the Clemenses in this period, also wrote an account of their the composition, noted that these sessions where there was a power of criticizing concluded with Susan performing on piano for them. So we've got music, art, travel, female editing, literary conversation. I think you get a sense of Nook Farm as this intellectual hotbed. Thank you. Oh, and sorry, and then here is just a piece of the manuscript that perhaps that crossed out section was something that Susan or Olivia criticized.
And next slide, please. So I just thought it would be worth taking a little look at the Mark Twain House today and thinking about it, because it's a house that was built just after the novel was published. And certainly the interaction between Twain and Livy and Susan and Charles Dudley Warner and their house and the settings that they were in influenced the building of the Mark Twain House. And it is a place that is founded, as James said, on that intellectual foment of a small, very close community. Think about these people being in and out of each other's houses, literally without knocking a lot of the time, as far as we can tell. And this comparison, it just sort of begs to be taken a look at between the library in the Twain House and the library in the Warner House. They could almost, in some sense, be one in the same room. And if you were looking in the other direction in the Twain House library, you would see that the entire rest of the wall is completely lined with bookshelves. This is a family that read to each other and read a lot all the time. Next slide, please. The dining room was also a place of creative foment. I'm sure that some of the conversations that the Warners and the Clemenses had over the Gilded Age took place over the dining room table. The Clemens family entertained in this dining room 2 and 3 times a week frequently. And frequently the visitors were other members of the Nook Farm community. Twain is known to have tried his material here. He talked about his stories, his characters. He tried them out on the guests to see how it all worked. And next slide. And lastly, of course, his billiard room, which was also his writing study. And off in the far corner, the back, right in the center of the photograph, the back corner of the room is a small table. He originally, when he took over this room, his original writing study had been down in what became the classroom for the girls, but it got too noisy down there. So he retreated to the 3rd floor where the billiard room was and set up a desk there, but noted in a letter to a friend that he really couldn't write at that desk because he was too busy looking at something he'd rather be doing, which was the billiard table. And so he set up this table in the back corner over there so that he'd be staring into the corner. And it was from that table that he wrote the likes of Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, Life on the Mississippi, Prince and the Pauper, and other books as well. A Tramp Abroad was also written in this room. And so this was the place where his books were born. It's the place where he did the hard work of editing. A lot of the actual writing was done in Elmira, New York, at his sister-in-law's house at Quarry Farm. But it was in this place of intellectual foment that these stories that we know Twain for today were written. And I encourage you to come and see the house. It is really one of the great writers' homes in America, and such an iconic part of American history, both the house and even far more, the man who lived in it and his family. So nothing substitutes for the real thing. Next slide, please. So we will leave this section here. Twain left Hartford with his family in 1891 amidst great financial stress for the family, and really never came back. But in 1900, Warner died just a decade prior to Twain's own death. And Twain does come back to Hartford for the funeral, and a Hartford current reporter cornered him for an interview. And Twain said of Warner, he was a beautiful spirit and a gracious presence. And he went on saying that being back in Hartford, quote unquote, brings back the Monday evening club to me afresh. And I can see all those men, such as they were in those days, talking upon all subjects, regulating the affairs of this planet. Warner, Robinson, Judge Pardee, Hammond Trumbull, the elder Hammersley, Dr. Bushnell, Dr. Knight, Dr. Burton, Dr. Wainwright, and the rest. It amounts to this, that the Monday Club is assembling in the cemetery, that our honorary membership is there, and we are all taking our places in that procession and arriving one by one. As I said, Twain himself would not follow to the cemetery for another decade, but interestingly enough, it was the last time that he ever visited Hartford. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, everyone. We're going to move now into sort of a discussion between the panelists, and then we'll follow that with Q&A. So I want to start this conversation off with addressing the name itself, the semantics of the term Gilded Age. Let me do a stop screen share here as well, so we can all see each other. Great. So Twain specifically chooses the term Gilded Age, and I wanted each of you to discuss sort of your take on the rationale as to why that was why he named the period, or why they decided to at least describe the period in that way. Particularly considering the irony in that he spent time in Virginia City, which was best known for the Comstock lode, which was a silver discovery. So he could have named it the Plated Age. So I'll let, how about James, you're nodding vigorously. So why don't you go ahead and start off with giving us your perspective on the title itself.
I'll start shaking my head so I can go last for the next questions. Well, something that's gilded obviously is not gold. It's not a golden age. It's a thin surface that exposes something far lower and less impressive. And there's the great character in the Gilded Age, side character who proclaims, a few years ago, 2 years ago, I wasn't worth a cent, and now I owe $2 million. Not I'm worth $2 million. I owe $2 million, and this is his achievement. So it's a Gilded Age because there's a surface of wealth, but as Van mentioned, it's founded on repression. It's founded on the corruption that to which Kerry alluded. So I think it's glittering, but it's not gold.
I think there's an interesting reflection in all of this too, that I always, when I lived in Newport, which I was there for 25 years, I always said that Newport's golden age was the 18th century because everything was centered in Newport, but that the Gilded Age was, as James alluded to, a little thinner. because the people who were coming there were from away. It wasn't about Newport, it was about what they brought to Newport and the veneer that they applied to it. But I think one of the fascinating things about this book is that it's really, as Twain's novels go, not such a great book. I remember talking to Kerry about it and seeing whether she wanted to be on the panel, and she said, "Oh, that book," and it's and at the same time, it's a great title. If we called it by such a thing back then, it would be a soundbite. It would be a Twitter feed. I think there's a moment in our society when, at so many different junctures, historically speaking, when somebody realizes that there is a trend occurring and they label it. And I think that's one of the great contributions of this book, is that whatever you think of it as a literary work, the substance of the story and the title itself are Twain and Warner labeling an era. And it's a label that's so good that it's stuck for 150 years almost.
Yes, I would agree with both James and Peter on the greatness of the title itself, because he's really, to me, when I read the novel and think about the time when he's writing it, he and Warner, this very transitional year of 1872, 1873, we're coming out of the worst war that this nation still has ever experienced. It was so divisive, it was so destructive, and people rushed to a new reality. And it was always, I think, a way of saying, oh, all that glitters is not particularly gold. And what's underneath is still some of the issues that we have, which a lot of people saw the sort of profit mongering and corruption of the Civil War era just being repeated, and not when would that ever go away? So to me, it is brilliant in how it defines an era, but it also defined a certain period in our country's political history where solutions like the senator from Kansas was being offered, but underneath that was something that was really tarnished and not worthy of to be looked at. So I agree with James and Peter. Brilliant title. Maybe a little bit overlong book, but a brilliant title.
Well, what I'd like to say is that the term never occurs in the novel itself. All right, it never comes out of the mouth of any character, and we have no documentary evidence as to the brainstorm that Clemens and Warner had that resulted in the title. But what sort of lingers with me is the deceptive nature of appearances, that's kind of implicit in the notion of gilding, right? You take base metal and you coat it with this very thin veneer, so that it looks way better than it really is. And one of the anecdotes that I like best in the Gilded Age concerns that funny dinner, pathetic dinner of turnips and cold water. And there's a visitor there and the house is freezing. I mean, he is, his teeth are chattering and he happens to bump up against the wood stove and the door of it comes open. And inside, instead of a nice stack of firewood, is a single candle. And Sellers says, oh, you want the appearance of heat rather than heat itself. It's more healthful, and that's the whole thing about gilding. You look at our nice wood stove, it doesn't have any wood in it. It doesn't provide any heat for the house. And just quickly, 1899, Mark Twain publishes a great story. It's called The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg. And the gilded sack of lead If you haven't read that story, you really should, because it's wonderful. But that is the object that sets the entire plot in motion, and it is a devastating critique of hypocrisy and greed and the concern with appearances. So, I think that what started with the novel, The Gilded Age, becomes a thread or an important theme that you can find throughout the duration of Mark Twain's work.
Thank you. Considering that no book can fully capture the full lived experience of every American during a certain time period, we do know that there are other historians, not necessarily novelists, but historians that have named the era different things as we've sort of progressed as a society. Lewis Mumford, his 1971 book, The Brown Decades, sort of capture that as a very different sort of term. Not that it's a soiled series of decades, more that it's the autumn of America before we sort of prosper into imperialism. And I wanted to sort of get everyone's take on the other ways in which this time period is described, because again, it is, as you mentioned, many of you have mentioned, it's a great leap forward in terms of America's development through its population and the influx of immigration, revolutionizing in industry and technology, but then also, as is very well described in the book, politics and the age of corruption. So if you would all mind commenting sort of on those different perspectives and different ways we can view this time period as well. Who's a good volunteer?
All right, well, I'll take a shot at it. It really is a time of enormous transition. You think that it starts shortly after the Civil War, and arguably the Gilded Age is over somewhere between about 1900 and 1914, although in Newport it lingers considerably longer as those families still continue to live there. But you think that it's a thing that starts with the Civil War and ends with World War I in essence. And that encapsulates so many different currents in American history, including imperialism. And Twain's an interesting character in this because when he is born, this is a small country that's got relatively little population. And by the time he dies in 1910, which is arguably at the end of the Gilded Age, it's a radically different nation. And he is a radically different person. As we heard earlier, his family did have enslaved people within it when he was born, although that changed fairly quickly. But as a young man, as a very young man, he still represents some of those racial inequalities. But as he grows, as he marries, as he matures, as he becomes worldly, he too changes. And by 1885, he actually makes quite a public declaration in favor of reparations. And funds an African-American law student at Yale University from his own money, because he says, quote unquote, in a letter explaining himself to the dean of the Yale Law School, we have ground the manhood out of them and the fault is ours, not theirs, and we must pay. And he does. And the young man whose education he funds goes off to become what we think of today as a civil rights lawyer in some sense, and becomes a mentor for other African-American young lawyers and law students, the most notable of whom is Thurgood Marshall. And so you can trace this fascinating line from Mark Twain to Warner McGuinn to the first Black justice of the Supreme Court. That's an evolution that we see over about 100 years from 1865 to 1965. And those are Twain's years. I diverged a little bit from what you were talking about.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Peter. Anyone else? Well, if
I don't mean to. Oh, sorry, Leslie.
go right ahead, please.
Just to pick up on your point about politics, I think the Gilded Age, even if the novel doesn't necessarily resonate, some aspects of the political culture of the day resonates now. It's a period of extremely high electoral turnout and extremely stable party loyalty, highly partisan voting habits, and enormous amounts of campaign literature was produced for each election, voluminous newspaper, the mass media of the day, but it all hung on only a handful of states that were called the doubtful states, not swing states. So in many ways, there's this extreme fever pitch where people are voting defensively to keep the other side out, and it's exceptionally partisan. And there's a really interesting moment where the Gilded Age, in many ways, emotionally, politically, in terms of economic disparities, very much does resonate with where we are today. And I don't know if the novel is necessarily relevant, but I think the era is increasingly so.
Really good thoughts here. I know when I think of this term, how do you characterize this period, like Peter said, from the end of the Civil War to about 1910? Well, historians have called it the age of the robber baron. That was a phrase that you really found in the literature for a long time. And then others would say, but then by the 1890s, turn of the century, that was giving way to the progressive era, which really did bring reform of some meaningful levels to so much of American society. And then you have, the American imperialism, because it's not just the Philippine War in the 1890s and the Spanish-American War of that time frame that people often go to. It was the great wars that the United States launched against the Native American tribes of the West. And the West was then, the nation was completed through that first act of imperialism in the 1870s that then defined so much of what was happening to about 1910. But, as I have worked on these issues and with different communities across the country, I really come back to that theme that I mentioned earlier, the age of Jim Crow. You do have the first official Jim Crow laws passed in 1875. You have the Supreme Court ratifying that as the law of the land in 1896. And then, of course, you have the sad spectacle of a president of the United States being Woodrow Wilson lauding D.W. Griffith for the entirely racist and just god-awful movie, The Birth of a Nation, at the time of World War I. So Clemens' path is a great path that you wish more of the American intellectual elite had followed at that time. Unfortunately, few did.
I think my colleagues have covered this brilliantly, so I'm not going to weigh in here.
Oh, that's fine, Kerry. We also have a lot of great questions coming in too, so I think we'll turn to the Q&A part of the evening. 34 already, my goodness. We'll try and get through most of them. I don't want to keep everyone this Thursday evening, but I think one of the most frequent questions we've received is, how was the novel itself received when it was first published?
It sold pretty well. It was not, as Peter alluded, it wasn't his bestseller, but I for some reason the number 40,000 copies within the first year is sticking in my mind. I think that the sales for it sort of fell off, after kind of the first flush of novelty. And then I think it was eclipsed by The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and the other books, the other novels that Clemens, solo author, all right, that follow in rapid succession. And I also think, I quoted that letter that he wrote to Mary Mason Fairbanks about, read my chapters, not Warner's. I do think that there was a sense, perhaps not the majority of readers, but that that the novel was very uneven, right? And that the chapters written by Warner tended to drag a bit. You know, I remember reading one contemporary review. I don't recall which periodical it was published in, but it said, you know, it's not either one of their best work, right? You know, I mean, we've come to expect from Warner a kind of gentle humor, you know, and where is it in this? You know, so I think that its popularity waned fairly soon after its original publication.
And to that point, a great question. Did the writing or even the reviews, I suppose, of the novel strain or strengthen the relationship between Clemens and Warner, if that's known?
Apparently not. You know, Twain developed pretty strong feelings about various people. Bret Harte, the short story writer, starts out as a friend, but later on, you know, he really doesn't like him. So he could change on his opinions of people pretty readily, but there he was going back to Hartford for Warner's funeral and saying absolutely lovely things about him. So no, I guess they managed to work it out.
Even if the book didn't. For Dr. West, do you believe, as the Tennessee state historian, that the novel depicts the state of Tennessee or the culture of Tennessee correctly during the time period?
Well, I mean, it's a stereotype, but in many ways it's correct. There is that feeling that, oh, we'll all get rich one day. You still encounter that. You encounter the sort of boosterism. I mean, you know, Tennessee is one of those states in the Union that really came about during that age of boosterism. And you know, Twain, of course, always parodied that. So, yeah, I can understand on some level why maybe Jamestown and Fentress County celebrate the conception of Mark Twain instead of the pages of this novel. But if you read the novel, there's a lot of truth in it.
That's great, thank you. We're also getting some great comments from others who are including some of the other names the era is given by various historians, including The Great Barbecue, which is also one of my favorites by Vernon Harrington. And then also Howard Mumford's The Age of Energy. So lots of different ways to describe this time period. So thank you for those who are including those. This is a rather general question, but I think it might be on the minds of many people, particularly those who aren't as scholarly and is familiar with Twain himself, but why did Clemens decide to use the name Mark Twain?
Well, many, and I'll let my colleagues speak on this as well, but many writers at the time had a nom de guerre. I mentioned Artemus Ward. That wasn't actually his name. That was his nom de plume, excuse me, not nom de guerre. But Mark Twain is, when you're taking a riverboat down the river or up the river, and you're coming to shallow water, the leadsman goes up to the front and he sounds the depth by throwing in the lead, and he calls things out, and he calls out the depth. And Mark Twain means 2 fathoms, which is 12 feet, which is sufficient water for a riverboat to go in. Less than Mark Twain means you're shallowing up pretty fast, and you need to think about changing your course. So there's kind of an interesting theory that I heard somebody propound, that Mark Twain is that verge right between safety and danger. It's that edgy place. But Twain himself claimed that he took it from somebody else who'd been using it, but that's been kind of debunked at this point. Kerry, James, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, this is a subject of perennial debate among Mark Twain scholars, and you probably don't want to be in a room when they're talking about it, because some very heated emotions arise. The sort of primary rival theory to the one that Peter has just described is that in his days out in Nevada territory, he was very fond of drinking and always short on money. And so at the saloon, he would say Mark Twain, right, to put not one drink, but 2 drinks on his tab. In the end, I don't think, it matters. I think the point that Peter just made about that edgy place, having a pseudonym allowed him great license and liberty to say things that the conventional Victorian gentleman, and this is, I know Peter gave a plug for coming to visit the house in Hartford, but I think this is one of the sort of most profound takeaways. For many years, I would bring my college students there, and they'd read a lot of Twain, and then they walked through the doors of that house with the Tiffany stenciling and, the wonderful furniture, and they're like, he lived here, right? I mean, there's that disconnect between folksy humorist, right? I don't see any pints about that frog that's better than any other frog, right? His love of the vernacular, and then this very, in some ways, conventional family man, right? And Victorian gentleman, a patron of the arts, right?
And Twain was quite aware that by the end of his life that he created this sort of alter ego.
Absolutely.
And there are instances where you can see that. He wrote marginalia in every book that he ever read, whether it was his or whether he borrowed it from you or whether he'd just taken it out of your house and given it back to you later. And people would ask him whether he had read a certain book, and in order not to look too intellectual, he'd say, no, I've never read that book. And yet there's a Twain scholar who's expert, who's really gone to great lengths to create a catalog raisonné of everything that Mark Twain read. And he has found books that Mark Twain denied reading that have Twain's marginalia in them. And to go a little further with that, very late in his life, I think it was in a hotel register. He had to sign the hotel register, and he put his name as Samuel Clemens, but he wrote his occupation as Mark Twain. I've created this alter ego. This is actually, this is my job. So
it's also worth noting that his name, I think, sounds more normal to us than it would have in the 19th century. Mark was not actually that common a 19th century man's name. Mark Hanna was an important political fixer in the US, and Mark Pattinson was an important English scholar, but those are about the only 2 19th century Marks that I can actually think of. And Twain more obviously meant the number 2. So I've often compared his pen name as sounding a little bit old-fashioned. Humphrey Duo might be more of a comparison to today. It has become more of a normal name and less of an obvious humorist's tag.
And he had other nom de plumes. I can't remember them. I know you guys do. What were some of the other ones? Do you remember them, James? Kerry?
I think it's a Kerry question.
Well, I know that one of them has the surname Blab in it.
W. Eponymous Blab.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so Mark Twain was the better choice.
Yes, absolutely.
And perhaps even unknowingly, he influenced the name becoming popular. Who knows?
I would have to believe so. His celebrity, celebrity is something we're so used to today. We don't realize that it was a less common thing to see celebrity. And Twain is a celebrity within this country with Americans, but he's also an international celebrity. When you ask people internationally to name an American in the 19th century, Mark Twain is one of the first people that's going to come to mind. So yes, he may have popularized the name. That's entirely possible.
Well, and to that point, he also probably characterized what American culture was perceived as internationally for many people and for many generations.
Very much so.
We must have many Rhode Islanders tuning in because of the name Roger Williams that popped up on Dr. West's part of the program. So as one of our last questions, Dr. West, could you give us a bit of background information about the Roger Williams University in Tennessee, and also what led to its closure?
I thought this question might come up, so I'm all ready for it. The college began just as a school for Black children in the home of a white minister and a missionary from Massachusetts named Daniel Phillips. But then in 1865, they moved the classes into First Colored Baptist Church, which had been a freedmen's established church before the Civil War. And it then continued to grow. And in 1866, they gave it the name of the Nashville Normal and Theological Institute. And they received their first funding from the American Baptist Home Mission Society, which was based in New York City. So then they moved in 1874 to this location that was across the street from where they were building Vanderbilt University. And that's when they then changed the name of the school in 1883 to Roger Williams University. And here, you know, Black faculty member held positions and served on the board of trustees. Now you compare that to Fisk University, that didn't happen to a few years later. And Rogers Williams developed its master's program by 1886. So, you know, it's very prominent. But as racial attitudes hardened, the idea of this school being across the street from Vanderbilt University was just not acceptable to the dominant society. So in 1905, two events happened. The first is a fire that destroyed one of those buildings that I showed the slide of. And it came with a warning, you need to move. You need to move. Well, the college got together and decided, you know, we're not moving. So a few months later, the second building was burned down, and then they had no choice. They moved to North Nashville to a new campus. Now, the sort of neat ending to this is the school then just struggles and it eventually gives up that campus to what is known as the American Baptist College. Well, it's ABC, as we know it locally, where the sit-in strikers were trained. Kelly Miller Smith was a prominent minister, and John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, Diane Nash all took classes there in nonviolence and the sit-in strikes. So that institution ends up 100 years later transforming Nashville once again.
And the nation too. I can't thank each of you enough for joining us tonight. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Each of you bringing your expertise and your knowledge. I'm sure our attendees would agree with me in that respect. And thank you to those who registered and were able to join us. We hope you enjoyed the evening. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions that you posed, but we hope that you'll find each of our panelists and perhaps send them a query or a fan letter, because I think that they deserve it after this evening. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good night.
Good night.